Okay, folks, I think we will make a start. So welcome, my name is Anthony Reddy. This is fourth week in Oxford. That probably means not a lot to some of you, but it officially means that we're kind of halfway through the sprint that is Oxford's terms. Our speaker this evening is Andrew Methwen of the AMAR Foundation, who will be speaking about fighting humanitarian trench warfare. And you see this in Iraq, Romania, Ukraine, and beyond. This is part of a series looking at peace and peacemaking that is done in conjunction with the Bruder Hof community. And we are greatly indebted to our colleague, Dr. Peter Petkoff, who has helped to create this particular series. So, Andrew, we are in your hands, and please share your thoughts with us.
Okay, thank you.
You've got the slide as well, so yeah.
That's not showing yet.
It is showing to everyone.
No, I'm just if you have a camera on me for that, then I'll tell you at the right moment when to switch it on.
Yeah, I've got the camera on you.
Is that what people are seeing there?
Yeah. No, they're seeing both you and this.
Okay, they don't get to see the slide until about 2/3 of the way through.
So I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, I'll tell you when to share. Well, good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, everybody. Apparently we're now on Christchurch time as well, and it's Halloween, so yeah, interesting evening. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak at this important seminar series. I have to say I haven't enjoyed a good essay crisis for at least a decade. Some of the thoughts this evening are at least 50 minutes old. That said, some of the ideas behind this are actually about 6 years in gestation from when I started in this game. So the Centre for Religion and Culture, thank you very much indeed for bringing me here. And the theme of the term is More Peace and Reconciliation, Emerging Challenges and Religious Responses. I've been given fighting humanitarian trench warfare from the Yazidis in Iraq to Romania, Ukraine and beyond. If I could introduce myself and the AMAR Foundation, my name is Andrew Methwen. I'm Chief of Staff of the AMAR Foundation, International Charitable Foundation for the last 6 years, based in its London office. Previously, I was an officer in the British Army and did tours in Bosnia and Iraq, so you'll find out in a second why. I'm pleased to have known Peter for the last 6 years through our overlapping work at AMAR on religious tolerance in Iraq, and he's currently actually attended several of our conferences. So I've been invited to speak as probably I call myself an accidental practitioner in the margins of my day job, which is trying to run health centres and education centres and vocational training centres in Iraq and other places. And I seem to have picked up a sideline in promoting the soft aspects of cultural preservation and noting and promoting the awareness of its overlap with religious protection. So I outlined my talk this afternoon on religion and culture, humanitarian trench warfare. It's going to be a game of two halves. First, I'm going to talk about the overlap between religion and cultural protection. And this very much fell out of, first of all, I was on a panel with Peter at the margins of the British government for freedom of religion, I believe, Zoom conference back in July, and subsequently with working through. Keeping up. So yes, so conference in July, and actually then a follow-on conference, AMAR's own conference, and then another one in with Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City, Provo, Utah, a month ago, and then more broadly about what is cultural protection, which is of interest to me, and I hope is may or may not be enlightening to some of you. So in the first half, I'm going to talk about AMAR, International Charitable Foundation in general. I'm going to then talk in more detail about AMAR's relevant work on freedom of religion and belief, particularly for the Yazidis in northern Iraq, Kurdistan region of Iraq. I'm going to touch in passing about AMAR's work in Romania for Ukrainian refugees, because Peter included it in the title. And then I'm going to lay out some thoughts on how religion can or cannot make a difference in reconciliation, perhaps where it cannot. And say AMAR works in Iraq, where I'll euphemistically put it, that religion could be part of the solution, but has previously been the source of the challenges. As one of the speakers at the conference in BYU International Centre for Law and Religion Studies Symposium said 4 weeks ago, religious intolerance, alas, is often the cause or part of the cause. I would suggest also, along with other threats to a group's perceived identity, equally very much the freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom and promotion of religious tolerance, and attitude of living that is very much the answer. In preparation for this seminar, and as I say, listening to earlier seminars in the series and the various conferences recently, where Peter chaired a panel and I caused me to do some digging on what exactly is and should cultural protection be. So the second part will be looking into that, and I had some informal conversations with the various archaeologists and part-time service reservists of the British Defence Joint Cultural Protection Unit, Cultural Property Protection Unit, which has thrown up some interesting material. Again, that may or may not be, it was news to me. You may not know it all already if you've been more closely in the field. Anyway, and so I'll share my thinking on that in the second half and then make some conclusions. So first, if I may talk about AMAR. The charity was founded by our chairman, Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne, Emma Nicholson, in 1991 to aid the Marsh Arabs. And these have been driven by Saddam Hussein into refugee camps in Lebanon and Iran. Basically, the Shia minority or Shia majority were driven out of southern Iraq overseas. AMAR's model was practical to provide healthcare, primary health care centres, PHCCs, health clinics, and education, schools, primary schools. And it relies on finding the Iraqis' own human capital, the doctors and the teachers, and then raising funds at the market rate. A typical doctor's salary is $900 a month. Raise funds to pay them to run their own clinics and schools in the refugee camps. And that's a model that served as well, and we're still doing a little bit of that in some places around Basra. After the fall of Saddam, AMAR went on to establish 83 schools and 75 clinics in Baghdad and the Basra marshes, and have now mostly been handed over to the local authorities in a sustainable way. Over the years, AMAR has delivered over 10.5 million health consultations that we know of. We've also worked in other countries, Romania for a long time, and now for Ukrainian refugees there. I'm going to talk a little bit about all that later. In Somaliland, in Afghanistan, in Kashmir, and again recently in Lebanon. In Romania, Baroness Nicholson founded a parallel charity, which is now part of the AMAR stable, which promotes the integration of disabled and special needs children with the able-bodied. That's been running since 1990 and is now expanding to assist Ukrainian special needs children, refugees. I'll say a bit more later. So talking in detail about AMAR's relevant work in FORB and where this has overlapped and the overlap between religion and culture. I should say at this point that although I speak about the Yazidis, I don't pretend to speak for them or to speak better than they would do themselves. And alas, are not here today. And I'm sure they'd be delighted for an invitation to speak. The Yazidis are an ancient faith, possibly 4,000 years old, and they see themselves as the first of the monotheistic faiths. There are approximately 600,000 Yazidis, of which there are 200,000 overseas, mostly in Germany. There were 4,000 in northern Iraq who were driven into the Kurdistan region of Iraq, KRI, by Daesh back in 2014. Of these, about 200,000 have returned to Mosul, and nearly 200,000, mostly from the areas west of Mosul, around Mount Sinjar, are still languishing in IDP camps in KRI. And that's where AMAR has done most of its work recently. Their faith, very interesting, is a syncretic mix of other religions in the region. And it's not clear who borrowed which bit from whom. So you can map, oh, that looks a bit Christianity, that looks a bit like Islam, that looks Zoroastrian, or who actually got it from whom at which point. The religion was formalized by their spiritual leader, Sheikh Hadi, in the 12th century. And Baroness Nicholson and I visited their main temple site in Lalish, near Dohuk, KRI, so near Erbil, just over a month ago. They are not people of the book, i.e. the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Yazidis is an oral, spoken or recited tradition, and nothing has been written down previously. As such, they were deemed beyond the pale by ISIS and Daesh, and subject to particular atrocities. Music is key to their religion, and it is core. It's not only just a beautiful adjunct. So I'm sure you can go to Evensong in Christchurch, and it's all beautiful. But for a Yazidi, you believe that music is how God placed the soul into Adam. So for them, music is absolutely critical. As pagans and not people of the book, they were considered fair game by ISIS and Daesh when they rolled through northern Iraq in 2014. Mosul fell. There were concerns at the time that Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan region, and even Baghdad itself would fall. Mount Sinjar, west of Mosul, was overrun. The Yazidis fled for their lives, and 20,000 didn't make it. Estimates. The men and the old women were murdered, and the young women were dragged into captivity, and the boys brainwashed. And several thousand survivors basically had been held as sex slaves, have returned, and several thousand are still missing. AMAR's help for the Yazidis since 2014, straight after within a month of the catastrophe happening, as follows. On the practical side, clinics and mental health support. We provided 5 clinics with what I call standard services, basically GP, family health, pharmacy, dentists, that sort of thing. That was up until essentially our funding ran out during COVID. We provided mental health for a further 3 clinics. What is now the buzzword is mental health and psychosocial services. And I do have an amusing memory of visiting a certain government secretary of state. And we asked him for some more money to do more of this, and was cheerfully told, "Oh yes, but everybody's doing psychosocial these days." And when you dug into it, yes, it was other people's clinics, but we were the ones who were actually providing the psychosocial services. But never mind. We expanded it with American funding, thank you very much, in 2018 to cover 30 clinics, which was screening 300,000 patients every month. You came in, you were screened for did you have mental health conditions. The way that worked, which we developed in close collaboration with the health director for Dohuk Governorate, that's about 1.8 million Kurds and 1 million IDPs and refugees at peak, was based on something called the WHO mental health gap, developed in about 2005. It's worth a diversion. How do you provide mental health care in low and middle income countries where just psychiatry has not been a thing previously? And essentially for the lowest level of mental health disease and burden, and forgive me if there's any doctors here, so I'm getting my terminology slightly muddled, but anyway, levels 1 to 2, of which up to 4 is the highest severity, levels 1 to 2, the low level stuff. There's a Pareto distribution, so 80% of the time it's 4 standard low level conditions, which 80% of the time the GP, the family health, the clinic can actually treat if only they're on the lookout for it and they're prepared to do something about it. So essentially, we promoted that model, and you go out and you give additional training or inducements to the GPs to consider mental health issues, and they spot the ones who they can actually do something about at that level without overloading the system higher up. I'd crunched the sums in the UK for the equivalent catchment area. There would be 329 psychiatrists in 2014. Dohuk had 4. They're now up to about, I think they trained about 30 psychologists on a special program at Dohuk University. And as I say, the part of this is also AMAR runs a program of what's called women health volunteers in each of the clinics who do outreach, if that's the right word, from linking up the sort of families into the health clinics. And so you can select some of those to act effectively as social workers. So the social worker screens anybody who comes into the clinic, says there might be something going on here, and they send them to the doctor who's received the top-up training on basic psychiatry. We still continue more advanced psychiatric services in 2 IDP camps, and I was there at the end of September with Baroness Nicholson, and that is they're called Essie and Akanke up by the lake in Mosul Dam. I think I want to talk now about Yazidi music, amongst the other things we've done for the Yazidis. And in 2019, AMAR ran a project with the British Council, sponsored by Department of Culture and Media and whatever it stands for, Digital Culture and Media, and through something which they call the CPF, the Cultural Protection Fund, which those in the Culture Centre might have heard of. And that project was specifically to record and preserve Yazidi music, which groups into 2.5 brackets, I call it. There's the religious music, which we'll talk about a little in a second. And then their traditional music, which then breaks down between their formal and their informal music for the people's music. And that is of relevance when we finally put the slide up towards the end on how the UNESCO splits the difference on these. With traditional music, there's more work ongoing, and we have qualitatively identified mental health benefits to survivors from Daesh. And we're still exploring the wider benefits of community singing. And if Peter wants to ask me a question about community singing versus basket weaving versus football at the end, I'll be delighted to expand at length and also make a pitch for somebody can please fund me for it, but can do the study. Anyway, on the religious music, which is very interesting, Yazidis have a very small cast of priests, about 10 or so, called Qawwals, and nothing is written down, it's all memory, rote learned. And they basically have a chant for every occasion in the annual cycle. And being a Brit, it's very similar to the Psalms. It's never been written down, and the trainee priests sort of go in as teenagers, and they spend years and years and years rote learning every single music for the right chant for the right occasion, and that is their role. You're kind of born into it, and once you're there, you provide it for the rest of your life. Their music was at risk of irrecoverable loss whilst under threat from ISIS and Daesh. And what I would call the golden thread from generation to generation would have been broken. So we worked with the Qawwals with a British Council CPF funding to record a full annual cycle and deposited this in the Bodleian Library for safekeeping in February 2020. Little do we know what was around the corner a month later. Anyway, as for the Yazidis, music is part of their religion and core to their sense of identity. And I'll come back to my thoughts on sense of identity as I continue my talk. ISIS were very much attacking that sense of identity for what it is to be a Yazidi. And again, we can talk about that in questions at the end. The key point is I noticed this overlap between cultural protection and religious protection. And I say this whenever I go to conferences. There's also an overlap with sexual violence and conflict, which is a big policy theme of the attack on the Yazidis, the attack on the Yazidi girls, the attack on the Yazidi priests. In terms of the people's music, formal and informal, we have more work ongoing on that. So that was about teaching the music, Yazidi folk music back to the, some of the Yazidi survivors. And we were monitoring how that's improved, mental health benefits of taking part as that music therapy. Turning to some of AMAR's other work to promote freedom of religion, I think one project worth mentioning, we ran a project for the EU called EU Countering Religious Discrimination, EUCRD, which was a bottom-up approach, and it did show that you can shift attitudes over a period of time. It ran for 3 years in 2016 to 2018, and was in a dozen colleges and universities in the southern 3 provinces of Iraq. The rolling program consisted of rotating student groups of sixth formers and undergraduates through a repeated 6 or 8 week lunchtime seminar syllabus. Basically, you bribed them with a free lunch, and they turned up and had essentially a guided seminar on comparative religion and religious tolerance. The syllabus was bespoke to Iraq, and it was very much designed for what we thought would work with for them. There is a banner, being ex-army, there's a banner over the #1 parachute school of the RAF which says knowledge dispels fear. Knowledge dispels fear. So you go and ask how many in the Shia heartlands had actually met a Christian, never mind a Sunni. Okay, well, here's old lady Mrs. Miggins up the road, and actually you have now met a Christian, and she's not quite as threatening as you might have been led to believe in the school playground. The key thing was there was a measurable shift in attitudes towards the end. The program was highly regarded by the EU field team. The funding dried up. Again, a little discretion, but we were told that the new policy wasn't enough localism going on in the EU programs, and therefore we needed to have an Iraqi partner. When we tried to explain to them, and part of the AMAR model is we only use local staff. There is no Brit swanning around in a Land Cruiser in Iraq with a big security detail. It is all Iraqi, and it always has been. So you find the local doctors and teachers, and they ran it themselves. trying to explain to them that we didn't need or have a local partner. We were our own local partner because we had the Iraqi field team and did not compute with the Tickmark exercise. So anyway, they said the program was great, and then the money dried up. Anyway, it is an example of where I think religion can help with peace building. And again, another example would be in the recent conference with Peter chaired on freedom of religion in July, and Peter chaired one of the fringe events. And again, I was able to bring out this overlap between what I call soft cultural protection, we'll come again to soft and tangible cultural protection, and religious freedom at the end. And in fact, it was because of that that triggered a lot of my thinking here today, and some of it's new, although you may or may not. So we worked all that out for ourselves already. Again, I stress the point about identity includes religion and but also soft aspects of culture and its outward manifestations of that identity and its importance. I think a final example of AMAR's work on freedom of religion before I start to draw some conclusions to this first part would be something called the Windsor Dialogue, which was co-founded by Baroness Nicholson, the Right Reverend Dr. Alistair Redfern, one of our trustees who was then on the Bishop's bench in the House of Lords as Bishop of Derby, and also worked with the Baroness on the Sexual Violence and Conflict House of Lords Select Committee, and also Elder Geoffrey R. Holland of one of the Quorum of the 12 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. This conference series started in 2016. I know Peter's been part of it on several occasions. We've now had half a dozen conferences at St. George's House, Windsor, several times, in Cumberland Lodge, Windsor Great Park, several times, hence the name, the Windsor Dialogue, but also in Baghdad. That was very interesting organising that one, and in Cheney Gates in the precincts of the Westminster Abbey back in July. So Brigham Young University International Centre for Law and Religion Studies is very kindly sponsored and partnered for the last 3 conferences, and we're very grateful for that. The aim of this series has been to explore causes and remedies of religious persecution and its links to forced migration. We've examined parallels between the cases of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and their own migration across America to Utah, the Yazidis' flight to Mount Sinjar, and several other case studies. I know in particular Professor Brett Schaaf's at ICLRS has been exploring that theme of persecution to inclusion. And I think a summary of where he's got so far is it's actually quite hard to draw a common theme or a standard roadmap that you could apply to the next time we get a genocide or a religiously motivated attack. There are common factors within religious persecution they don't apply every time, and yes, but it's very then hard to find common factors for societies or groups that have made a successful recovery. Each case is very much sui generis. I close this section with an insight from the Windsor Dialogue that the key for refugees and IDPs, again, it comes back to what would be best for their mental health, is restoration of agency, feeling that they've actually got some kind of control and direction, control over the direction of their lives, and removing that feeling of helplessness and with it the burden of mental health. I'll talk briefly about Romania and Ukraine because Peter asked me to do so, and this is a list of places where we're fighting in the trenches. Let me give you some background to that. So for completeness and variety, I'll say something about them. We had a parallel charity which has worked in Romania for over 30 years, basically since the fall of Ceausescu, again founded by Baroness Nicholson. It was a very important and helpful program, the most important and helpful program within that charity is on the integration of disabled and able-bodied mainstream school children. So sadly, a legacy of Ceausescu and the communists was that the state owned the children under some bizarre twisting of the law. And therefore, it would decide at an early age whether you were deemed sort of fit to be a good communist or not. And if you were deemed to be disabled, then you were carted off to an orphanage, what I call an orphanage archipelago, in the days when most people didn't actually have a car. If you took a child and dumped it in an orphanage in the next county, they might as well be on the far side of the moon because nobody knew where they'd gone. And if the orphanages never actually met anybody in the local town, then again they were running completely blind. AMAR paired up the orphanages with the mainstream schools. At one point, we had about 280,000 children all taking part in what we would call youth clubs in the UK. Again, a lot of the local schools had no idea that this was going on under their noses in the sort of institutions next door. Typical ratio, 2 able-bodied to 1 disabled child, and the aim is to help in the rehabilitation. Again, dispel the prejudice against through interaction, and say knowledge helps dispel that prejudice, and so familiarity and loss of that ignorance. It's also very good in the getting in the way of child trafficking, which was an endemic problem with Ceausescu's regime, the deep state. And basically, if the children are known and part of a youth club, it's quite hard for them to then disappear. And we're now doing something very similar for Ukrainian special needs children, so who are refugees in Romania, which there are a few. So again, we ran summer schools for mixing Ukrainian with Romanian children. And we're about to start doing something similar with a sort of Saturday morning Sunday school type thing. And again, integrate with their equivalents in Romania. And again, with the summer schools, it was very interesting to see towards the end of a week, suddenly there's a magic moment where everything clicks. And what had been quite standoffish at the start suddenly joins together. Right, so what are we to make of all of this? And let me start drawing some conclusions. I personally find what I call the layers of the onion model of identity very helpful, although again, having done some research for this evening's talk in the last couple of weeks, if you wait long enough, you'll find there's another pet theory of psychology and knocking around, which emphasizes group psychology over individual psychology, but never mind, we'll go with this one for the time being. Our sense of identity consists of many layers, the layers of the onion. So I'm a son, father, brother, husband, British, a bit Scottish, and other aspects of my identity, very bad piano player, that sort of thing. If you want to find common ground with somebody, you find the common, and you emphasize the common humanity. I've talked about Christianity where I work in Iraq, and there are obviously very many different religions and ethnic groups which used to be able to rub along with each other. So how does one stress the common ground, and how can religion help? Now, I was talking with one of the attendees earlier, and I'm not a theologian. On the one hand, you could stress that almost all religions have an element of peace, love, and reconciliation. Equally, we could debate at the end how far it's Tom Holland's approach of the Enlightenment and universal human rights is actually a byproduct of Christianity light, and actually that those assumptions don't hold with every faith or belief system around the world. But anyway, let us try and find the common ground, stress the positive and the overlap, and not become too hung up on the negative if we want to reconcile ourselves. So interestingly, a speaker in the Utah conference from East Africa had mapped all the various religions in her area of activity and found there were actually 7 overlapping areas you could pick up on. We need to emphasize those. It's still a problem. It's not trickling down, and I'll say a little bit more shortly about how far the top-down approach. Not sure that works. I know that Bishop Alistair Redfern is looking at it needs to work at the group level rather than the macro level. And I've just talked about at the individual level, it's about finding that rapport. There are these theological imperatives which I think are a stumbling block to my religion tells me I'm not allowed to, my religion is better than yours, and I'm not possibly allowed to compromise and try and agree. Everywhere I look, I see this overlap between religion and culture because it's part of your identity. So when I was at the conference, Brett held one here 3 years ago, I was trying to make sense of what it was that had actually driven Daesh to go and run around and massacre everybody. And I found it very helpful. I suddenly had a light bulb moment to map their motives to Thucydides and his 3 drivers of fear, honor, and interest. Fear is that your identity is a threat to my identity. Now, honor is a twisted interpretation of a theological imperative that you have to defeat rival religions. It is your duty to kill apostates and unbelievers. And interest, by the way, you get to take your neighbor's farm and daughters. And we have many instances where there was one of the ladies we've been helping where she realized that the chap who was raping her was actually the sort of mayor from the neighboring village, or the chap who was raping another victim had been the grandfather's dentist. But something weird happened, and as soon as all normal rules of society are off, then you get their farm and you get their daughters. I'm speaking here about the 90% of Daesh who are actually the locals who threw in their lot with what they thought at the time were the winners, not necessarily with those who quietly escaped from UK or wherever internationally to join. There's a separate study knocking around somewhere on what had motivated the foreign fighters. The other point to make about fear, honour and interest is in the City of London, they talk about fear and greed. So obviously there is no honour in the City of London. Anyway, so how can religion help in peace building? First of all, I think to reduce the fear, I mentioned knowledge dispels fear. So there are programs like countering religious discrimination, where you increase the awareness of what it is that's out there and make them realize, individuals realize that it's not actually a threat to, it doesn't have to be a threat to their identity. So make the unknown known and make it less threatening. I think you need to challenge and question those flawed theologies that say, honour requires that there's a theological imperative to attack those threats to identity. And we need to promote less confrontational interpretations, and the way to do that is with a PR campaign. Third, I think it was Professor Cole Durham, who some of you may know from the G20 Interfaith Summit, at the Abbey, who said, find the proponents in the other religions who recognise peace, love and reconciliation strands, so these 7 overlapping strands in the various religions and faiths, and reach across the divide, and we certainly need to do that. I think there's need for a sustained, in individual countries, there's need for a sustained PR communication campaign to change the attitude at the grassroots. And again, more discussion to be had with the likes of Bishop Alistair as to, is it grassroots, or is it with, you need gatekeepers, but gatekeepers at a, let's say, little platoon level rather than at purely at a national level, and I'll come to that in a second. And one of the things in terms of a sustained PR campaign, I would love to have enough of a budget to allow the inclusion of something like a sympathetic storyline towards Yazidis in an Iraqi soap opera on TV, or televising a visit by the Yazidi Ladies Choir that we formed of the Yazidi survivors, going and being seen to be on national television news whilst being greeted and welcomed by the Iraqi president, who did invite, but alas, budget and COVID got in the way. In terms of fifth final point on this, high-level engagement is not enough. I say if we hadn't decided to go for our once-in-a-decade IT migration whilst I was away on holiday last week and came back this morning to find that I don't actually have a laptop working, hence why I'm talking rather than showing you slides, I would have shown you a picture of Baghdad 2008, and so 2018, and we've got others before then, Mandaean, Shabak, Sunni, Shia, Yazidis, Christians, all standing there holding hands on the stage in a panel like this in a big conference, with fairly big hitters, all pledging on peace, love and reconciliation. I think that's great and it's marvellous. But my counter story to that, and again a digression, when I worked at the MOD, there was an international engagement liaison cell or something similar. And let's call them 2 RAF wing commanders called Waldorf and Statler, and you get the references. And they were the professional conference attenders. And whenever there was a conference or a meeting like this, you go and book them and they come and give the official line. And you go along and you bump into people sort of several months later. And they said, well, yes, we blah, blah, blah. We had this great conversation, and we think that whatever we said has now been inputted into the MOD because we had a conversation. And reality was that the 2 professional conference attenders were not actually connected to anything at all. So in terms of policy or budget, not actually changing anything. So I look around and I have seen some of these international conferences, and I've now been on the circuit for 6 years. You start to see the same old people turning up. But I am not seeing any evidence of either at the very grassroots level or somewhere halfway down. People are actually, the Sunday sermon, the Friday sermon from the minbar. Where is it actually saying, come on guys, we've got to go on people, we need to, we can't go around just beating up our neighbours or looking down our noses at our neighbours. There needs to be some kind of reconciliation or better awareness of this, or actually there's no need to be afraid of your neighbours because they're not a threat. And until I see that sort of thing happening, this is, there's a lot of the professional greeters, the official delegate from Lambeth Palace who goes to all the conferences and does the interfaith thing, but it's not something I see in the parish church on a Sunday. The theme of the sermon is not, interfaith dialogue and reconciliation. So unless I see that kind of push, and one of the interesting things to come out of the conference in 4 weeks ago was, yes, the now recognition there needs to be more at this level of action on the ground, not just interfaith talking at it at a high level. Summary of this, I think there are common threads to all religions. Those are the bridges for peace building, but we can discuss, is that completely true? Knowledge removes fear, the difference, the threat to identity, the mutual threat to identity. And I think there needs to be a sustained element, both at high level and also from grassroots up, to keep pushing this. So turning from religion more broadly to culture, given your religion and cultures in the title, if you like, and looking at soft culture and cultural protection. So I see the overlap all the time, and I discussed it back in July. Religion, identity, culture, soft culture, the work we do on sexual violence and conflict and trying to ameliorate that. So me being me, I went off and started doing what I call a survey or a literature search to see what was out there. If all else fails, go to the source documents. And turned up there's a difference between property protection and soft cultural protection. But at this point, again, I have to properly attribute to what's called the Joint Cultural Property Protection Unit. And again, the clue's in the misname of the British MOD, because it's more than just property protection. And they gave me some steers and signposting, what I call OSINF, open source information, because they don't formally have a public-facing policy, but there's all sorts of things they could point me to that probably encapsulated in how they think. So first of all, I would say I was wandering around Lalish, the Yazidi temple, 5 weeks ago, and happened to bump into a British architect who was overseeing a rolling program to restore, so restore, not renovate, but restore the original 12th, 14th century buildings. And again, the sideline on that was dear old Saddam, probably well-meaning actually, had decided that all these old cultural things didn't look good enough. And so he'd given them all a makeover in the 80s. And so hence why you have Babylon has sort of been rebuilt in brand new stone on top of the foundations, but it's all an 80s copy. Many years ago, I went to what is supposedly the oldest arch in the world, which is slightly narrower than that doorway there, X thousand years old, down in next to the Ziggurat of Ur, outside Nasiriyah Talil. Somebody had come in with a bit of really bad repointing, because Saddam had told them he wanted it fixed and made sure it wouldn't fall down, and things like that. And so dear old Saddam had basically given the equivalent of an Artex ceiling to this 12th century vaulted temple shrine. And the architect was in there overseeing a rolling program paid for by somewhere between the German government and the US State Department to remove all this back. And the interesting thing was he said he could restore just about anything, so as he knew what it was he was supposed to be doing in the original style from the 12th century. So you wanted the right sort of lime, mortar, cement mix and the sort of rocks, and they could find where the rocks had been brought from, and they could fix it so it wouldn't fall down without having to do too much cheating. So then I asked him, well, what if you were trying to do cultural protection, how would you do it? Now, his big idea was you have to identify the vulnerable sites in advance, and you have to do the surveys in advance. And I've since become an instant expert. All I knew about LADAR, but using lasers to do sort of what does the inside of a room look like. But I've since discovered there's something LIDAR, light detection and ranging, and simultaneous localization and mapping, where there's actually now apps on your phone, and you just walk around, and it doesn't even use range finding. It just says there's a point on the edge of that picture. And as I move around, if you're a bit mathematical, you get excited about the Kalman filtering. As you move around, it comes up with the best estimate as to where that point is on the edge of the picture compared to the other end of the picture and everything else behind it. And after a while, you can actually very quickly build up an idea of what the inside of a building or a room or an object actually looks like. Once you've done that survey, you've then got, and you've done high-res photographs, you can then actually recreate it if you had to at a later date. Challenges with this, on the one hand, you've got the UNESCO World Heritage Site list, but and I think actually that's what the Yazidi temple is slowly moving towards once it's been raised up. But equally, I was in Ireland last week on holiday. They've got 3 sites. So if your threat is actually to churches, they don't make the cut, or 99.9 of them don't make the cut. There's also challenges then as to nobody wants to, or there isn't the budget, or nobody wants to rush around and do these sorts of surveys until the last minute when it's too late, because the Russians are already rolling through the Donbass or are already bombarding you. Speaking of which, so interestingly, there was a Ukrainian rep at the conference a month ago, And his view on cultural protection was he had a rolling database where he was making notes of what the damage was. And I don't know how far he'd been able to go in there and record to these standards ready for restoration rather than renovation, restoration after when everything finally calms down in Ukraine. But collecting these cultural sites, and again, highly suspicious, ostensibly caused deliberately targeted by the Russians. Highly suspicious when Jewish war memorials or Ukrainian churches, all these rockets that somehow missiles that somehow managed to miss the nearby armaments factory went and hit those by mistake. And again, that's with a view to War Crimes Tribunal. And I did find one instance digging around where somebody had been tried. I can't remember if it was at Nuremberg or not, where cultural protection was actually, it might have been for Yugoslavia, cultural protection was actually on the charge sheet and stuck for war crimes. My research is then, as signposted, several source documents. First one is the Hague Convention, 1954, on the protection of cultural property in event of armed conflict. That was then updated, and again, I don't know, and I shall be doing some digging after this on something called the UNESCO Convention 2003, so more recently, obviously, on safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. There was some very interesting material. There's an in-house periodical called the British Army Review, which did a whole copy in 2017, specifically on the work being done by the Cultural Property Protection Unit, which was full of very interesting stuff. And in fact, it's not officially open source, but if you Google JSP Joint Service Publication 985, it gives the British Defence idea of what is and is not human security that actually reads extremely well if you're into cultural protection. And I promised Peter that given my computer crashed today, I'll send him both notes on this and also these references. It would have been a slide afterwards if you're interested. And one of the articles in the British Army Review gives the exegesis in the field. I don't know how this ties into the 19th century and the Red Cross and all the rest of it and the rise of international humanitarian law. One thing I have discovered recently is called Sivovich's law, which is if somebody claims that something was done for the first time, when you dig into it, you usually find they're about the third or fourth time that they've actually done it, but never mind. But anyway, the article in this case talks about directions from Eisenhower in 1943 and 1944 during the liberation of Sicily and later on after Monte Cassino in Northwest Europe, about the need to protect property and avoiding casualties as privacy. However, they should avoid repeating the likes of Monte Cassino. And again, I don't have the exact criteria for how you define what is or is not important in your religious and international culture, and where the boundaries lie for what does and doesn't make the mix. As I say, this was then, out of that, was then formally codified by the UN in 1954 in the Hague Convention. And in passing, I note, when I was in the army, we had a series of annual mandatory training, and part of which was law of armed conflict, and part of which was specifically, under cultural protection, you must not fight in or over such sites deliberately. Fast forward, and again, I don't know what motivated UNESCO to produce the intangible reference, but they obviously saw there was a gap, or it was more than just property protection; it was intangible cultural protection. And so there we are. So the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. Can we put the slide up now, please? Yeah. From which they seem to produce the hands model. It goes up. And again, apologies if everyone's seen all this before. So that's the hand model, and essentially it has, each finger represents a domain. And it's worth reading. Again, I'll share it with Peter, and you might be able to post it afterwards. The 5 layers or the 5 fingers of intangible heritage: oral traditions, the performing arts, social practices. I don't know if this is code for religion that to make it acceptable to the sort of multinational level. Social practices, rituals, and festive events. Again, that might overlap with what I call the formal Yazidi music of this is what you play at a wedding, or this is what you play at a funeral, as opposed to this is what you play at a party. Knowledge, and again, I'm not sure, knowledge practices, and again, I'm not sure if this is a euphemism for religion, but without demanding religious tolerance in countries where that's not accepted, and the traditional craftsmanship. And so what I see is quite a lot of, it's archaeology, and here's some ancient 2,000-year-old sites versus, actually, yes, but also here's something which goes back, a church which goes back several hundred years, which I identify because my family have been connected with it, and someone's now trying to blow it up. I'm just freshly thinking, where do you strike the balance between which ones you try and protect, or which is more important? My immediate reaction is, where does language come into this? Because I think language is terribly important in culture. And I think it's actually buried in the sense of the hand itself is supposedly supports the 5 fingers. So it recognizes that the 5 fingers overlap, and then they are supported by the hand, and language is part of that. And so part of that overlap, for instance, music would be singing, but also it would be dance for the Yazidis, and their oral traditions, which then goes into language, but you also then have instruments, which then becomes part of the pillar of what they call the traditional craftsmanship. And I know, for instance, the Prince's School of Traditional Arts, funded by formerly Royal Highness Prince of Wales, now His Majesty King Charles III, has branches in Clerkenwell and Azerbaijan and somewhere else, specifically teaching the teachers on how to do stone carving to restore religious buildings in Jordan, or how to make musical instruments in the sort of Silk Route style of Mugham music or something like that. I think the language is very, very important. And I give 3 examples. My late father-in-law is Irish, and therefore learned Gaelic in the 40s and 50s, and that was a minority sport back then. Whereas now everyone in Ireland is learning Gaelic. I happened to grow up, having moved from Scotland to England as a small boy. I happened to grow up next door to Monmouthshire, which I thought was Welsh, and then discovered actually it was English for 900 years, until it was, for very good reasons, reallocated to Wales for administrative reasons. But when it says it's Welsh on the map and everyone's given Welsh lessons, then after a while you think that it's Welsh, not English. And one of the towns where we're working in Romania at the moment, again doing a little bit of research, and it was Hungarian for 900 years, or run by Hungarians, and had a majority ethnic Hungarian population. Thanks to Mr. Stalin, it no longer has a majority Hungarian population. So try telling the Romanians on the Romanian side that they clearly are Romanian, and you try telling the Ukrainians on the Ukrainian side, but they're clearly Ukrainian, and very much going through a sort of transformative, no return status quo antebellum of the Ukrainian identity. The language you speak and the culture that therefore promotes, obviously, is very, very important. So following all this together with 10 minutes for questions, I think I've described the trench warfare of, as I say, day-to-day healthcare and education, and but stuff that was spilt out from that in Iraq and various places, and Romania. A point I would stress is just the overlap between freedom of religion. I see it also in sexual violence and conflict, and prevention of sexual violence and conflict initiative that's going on as a big international theme. Yes, there's clearly a need for cultural property protection, but also the soft, intangible cultural protection. And the overlap between culture and religion, we need to work on religion as a source of reconciliation, which I think is the theme of your seminar series. Find the commonality, knowledge, understanding, sort of dispels the fear of threat to identity. And I think that needs to be both at the high level. It's great that we all stand, the professional greeters all stand together and hold hands. But it also needs to be at the group level, the middle group level, and at the individual level. So I think that's enough from me. Thank you very much indeed. You asked me to speak for 45 minutes, and that's about right. So Peter, delighted to take questions.